Each episode of Brain Health Unchaining Your Pain with Dr. Ruth Allen is for educational and demonstration purposes only. The information shared in each episode should not be interpreted as medical advice. This episode should not be used to self-diagnose or self-treat any health, medical, or physical condition. Do not use this episode to avoid going to your healthcare professional or to replace the advice they give you. Consult with a trusted healthcare professional before doing anything contained in this episode. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact www.ruthmaryallen.com/connect. Welcome to the show, Brain Health Unchaining Your Pain. I am delighted to be joined by the wonderful Dr. Nathan Bryan. Welcome to the show, Dr. Bryan.
Thank you, Dr. Ruth. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
I'm so excited because I know it's been a challenge for us to get together, and I'm really, really interested in this topic that we're going to talk about today, which is all about nitric oxide and the importance that it plays in our overall health and also our brain health. Particularly because I think has been a key contributor to my dad passing away because he died of a heart attack, and I know that there's lots of the evolution of this amazing molecule came out of a Nobel Prize. But before we dive into that, I would love to know what you are passionate about in life right now.
Well, Dr. Ruth, everything I'm doing now is really kind of focused on my 20 years of research in basic sciences and understanding nitric oxide and how we move those discoveries and translate that into clinical medicine. So, we have a number of companies. We've got a drug company. We're developing these nitric oxide technologies into prescription drugs, going through FDA clinical trials, trying to get, safe and effective nitric oxide drugs for things like Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, ischemic heart disease, wounds, diabetic wounds, non-healing ulcers. Mm-hmm. And so really that's what I'm really, really excited about and passionate about, because I don't think that there's a single indication where nitric oxide at the right dose in the right patient wouldn't be beneficial. And so I truly believe that this will, completely change the landscape of healthcare and how we treat patients for the next 100 years.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And for those that don't know Dr. Bryan, because he is a force in the space of nitric oxide, he's an international expert in nitric biochemistry and molecular medicine. He's more than 20 years in academic research that's led to many seminal discoveries, and that's resulted in dozens of patents in the US and internationally. And his products from his innovations have really improved patient care for more than a decade. So you are really the expert when it comes to nitric oxide. But before we dive into your expertise, I'd love to know where it all started for you, where your science journey started, if you wouldn't mind taking us back.
Well, it goes back to probably when I was in middle school and high school. I was always good in math and science, but really didn't know what I wanted to do with that. And so after high school, I enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin, where I got a degree in biochemistry. And it was really during my undergraduate research that I got a chance to do undergraduate research, or during my undergraduate studies, I did research in a biochemistry lab and really fell in love with this concept of discovery, and really this intellectual freedom where you can ask any question you want in biology and then design experiments to answer those questions. I mean, really, there's no other profession that allows you that much intellectual freedom. And so I really fell in love with that concept. And then, with a degree in biochemistry, or a bachelor's degree in biochemistry, there's really not a lot you can do. So I knew I had to go on and further my education. So I enrolled in a PhD program in LSU School of Medicine in molecular and cellular physiology. And it was there I was introduced to this whole field and science of nitric oxide. And, a Nobel Prize had just been awarded for its discovery that we knew a lot about it. We knew it was an important molecule, but there were still so many unanswered questions in biology and physiology. So for me, that was really that led me on this path to answer these fundamental questions. And from there, I went to Boston University School of Medicine, where I did a fellowship in cardiology and cardiovascular biology. And then I got my first faculty position at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston, and I believe it was 2005. So that's really where I started my independent research career. And as you mentioned in the introduction, we made a lot of discoveries, and now our challenge is to take those discoveries and translate that into safe and effective therapeutics.
Yeah, I love that. And for those that are unaware of the role that nitric oxide plays in our overall health, and I think the discovery was as part of the cardiovascular system, wasn't it? Would you mind just providing a layman's overview or layperson's overview as to what nitric oxide is and what it does and why it's so important?
Yeah, of course. No, nitric oxide is a signaling molecule, but it's a gas. And so when it's produced in the body, it's gone in less than a second. But once it's produced, it starts a lot of these signaling cascades. So for instance, it tells other cells in the body what to do. Its main function is it tells the muscles surrounding all blood vessels to relax and dilate. So when you dilate blood vessels, you get an improvement in blood flow and oxygen delivery. You normalize blood pressure if you have high blood pressure. But it's also extremely important in oxygen delivery. So we cannot deliver oxygen from our red blood cells without nitric oxide. So that's kind of its main recognized signaling aspects as a vasodilator, but it also prevents inflammation in the body. It inhibits oxidative stress and the immune dysfunction. And really, those are the three characteristics of all chronic disease. You have inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. And we've realized that nitric oxide is what controls and regulates all three of those. But it's how our immune system fights off invading pathogens. It's a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, so it's extremely important in neurology and brain function and cognition. So we can begin to hopefully understand what goes wrong in patients that can't make nitric oxide. There are a number of symptoms and diseases that develop. They develop high blood pressure, erectile dysfunction. They have mild cognitive disorders that develop into vascular dementia, Alzheimer's if not corrected. You develop insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. You become exercise intolerant, chronic fatigue, immunocompromised where you can't fight off infections. So what we're learning now is that it's the loss of nitric oxide that really is responsible for the onset and progression of most, if not all, chronic diseases.
So, I mean, ultimately, it's pretty fundamental as a redox signaling molecule to ensure that you get the information to the right part of the body through nitric oxide as a redox molecule. To help your cell function effectively. Is that kind of correct in the context of cellular function?
No, I think that's spot on. You know, the human body is regenerative by nature, right? So we constantly wear ourselves out. We just have to replace and repair dysfunctional tissues. And about 25 years ago now, it was recognized that nitric oxide is what tells our own stem cells to mobilize and differentiate. So when we sense, so the body is always sensing its surroundings. Right. And so without sufficient blood flow, you don't get a good sensing. Without sufficient blood flow, you can't repair and replace tissues. So nitric oxide, one of its primary roles is to open up the blood supply. So now that cells can communicate with one another, there's an open line of communication and the human body can basically do its job, regenerate and heal itself. But without that constant communication, without that adequate delivery of oxygen and nutrients to every cell in the body, then there's miscommunication, there's confusion. The cells can't regenerate. You develop tissue dysfunction, end organ disease. And that's really the course of events that all relate back to a loss of nitric oxide production.
And what, I know there's quite a lot. I became aware of the real importance of nitric oxide through the Amen clinics, talking with one of the psychiatrists, Dr. Lowe, and how it's so important in the elasticity or the soft tissue in your heart to make sure that you've got ease of flow of blood flow and you don't get arterial hardening. And James Nest has written the book Breathe, where he talks about how we can personally enhance nitric oxide ourselves through the way in which we do breathing, in particular nasal breathing, which I've become a huge fan of, to allow the generation of nitric oxide in our system. But there's many ways in which we can generate nitric oxide, aren't there, by ourselves? Would you mind mentioning how people can kind of enhance the nitric oxide personally? And obviously there's a limit to how much we can do dependent on our baseline health level.
No, that's right. So today we understand that there's two ways the human body makes nitric oxide. So the first pathway, and it was the first pathway to be discovered, was an enzyme that's found in the lining of the blood vessels. And that cell is called the endothelium. So we call this enzyme the endothelial nitric oxide synthase. So that's what regulates blood flow, the second-to-second production of nitric oxide. As you mentioned, it prevents the hardening of arteries. It kind of keeps your blood vessels soft and compliant. So with each heartbeat, it dampens the pulse wave, and so it's less damage to the blood vessels. And that same enzyme is found in our epithelial cells, so in our airway sinuses. And so when we activate that enzyme through nasal breathing, and we create some shear stress on these mechanoreceptors, it tells our epithelial cells to produce nitric oxide, and then we breathe that into the airways. It's a bronchodilator, so it dilates the bronchioles, and we get an improvement in oxygen exchange, pick up oxygen, release carbon dioxide, and that's the basis for the cardiopulmonary cycle. But if that enzyme becomes dysfunctional and uncoupled, and this is the basis of really most age-related chronic disease. In the endothelium, we call this endothelial dysfunction. But in the epithelium, that dysfunction occurs too. So in people that have poor vascular health or endothelial dysfunction, you can do the nasal breathing and all these proper breathing techniques, but if you don't restore the function of that enzyme, you're not going to get any nitric oxide produced. And we can actually measure this with a nitric oxide analyzer. So we have to recouple the enzyme in the endothelium, in the epithelium. So now when we stimulate it or activate it, we can actually produce nitric oxide. So we understand how to do that. And then the other pathway where nitric oxide is produced is through diet. You know, this explains a Mediterranean diet, a vegetarian diet, a Japanese diet. But certain foods are enriched in inorganic nitrate. And then that nitrate, when we consume it, the body, through mostly bacteria that live in and on the body, convert that all the way down into nitric oxide. So now we can restore the function of nitric oxide through diet. We can restore the function of nitric oxide by recoupling the NOS enzyme. And really, that's the whole secret to longevity and proper cardiovascular health and preventing the onset and progression of all these chronic diseases.
And I loved, because I listened to your podcast with Dr. David Perlmutter, and also obviously watch your videos online. And I love the fact that how the importance of our diet for the generation of nitric oxide, which starts with what we obviously put in our mouth and how we chew our food, and what environment our mouth has in order for that nitric oxide to be generated from the nitrates. I wonder if you might be able to just explain it a little bit more to people about how the process really works in our mouth, and why we have to focus on oral health, but in a way that's very different to what the traditional outdated approaches are to what constitutes good oral health, because we have really enhanced our knowledge, haven't we, in oral health, and there's lots of great dentists out there now who are taking a much more functional approach to dentistry that is moving away from the misinformation that people have been fed. So I'd love for you to explain what the misinformation is and what we really should be doing in the context of oral health that not many of us are doing now.
Now, this is always kind of the aha moment for people when we tell this story. But you know, the science of nitric oxide is very complex, but really comes down to the basics that we've known for many, many decades, if not century. It's a balanced diet in moderation, and it's moderate physical exercise. That seems to cure a lot of these chronic diseases. But we understand mechanistically how this pathway works and what we're doing to disrupt it. So, for instance, when we eat green leafy vegetables like spinach, kale, arugula, celery, it's typically these green leafy vegetables that contain a molecule called nitrate, inorganic nitrate, or NO3 minus. So when we consume these vegetables, 90 minutes after we consume these, the nitrate's taken up in the gut and it's concentrated in our salivary glands. So now for the next 6, 8, 10 hours, each time we salivate, we're secreting nitrate, and then there are bacteria that live in the mouth on the crypts of the tongue that are nitrate reducers. And humans do not have this enzyme, so we're 100% dependent upon the bacteria to perform this 2-electron reduction of nitrate to nitrite. And now when we swallow our own saliva, we get a burst of nitric oxide gas in the stomach, provided the stomach can make stomach acid. And what we call the pKa, or the pH at which nitrite becomes protonated to form nitric oxide, is 3.4. So now after that meal, for the next 4, 6, 8, 10 hours, every time we swallow our own saliva, we get a burst of nitric oxide. That nitric oxide that's produced in the stomach kills things like H. pylori, the ulcer-causing bacteria, kill E. coli, Clostridium, so any foodborne pathogen. But it also enhanced the blood flow to the stomach, so you can enhance nutrients absorption like iron and selenium and chromium and B vitamins. And so, number one, you need three things. You need sufficient nitrate from your diet, so you can throw in some more green leafy vegetables. You need the proper bacteria, and you need stomach acid production. Mm-hmm. And here's where things go wrong. Number one, most people don't get enough nitrate from their diet because, as we published in 2015, organically grown vegetables typically have 10 times less nitrate than conventionally grown. And most people have moved to this organic type of feeding and prevent the herbicides and the pesticides from being in their food supply. But the problem is there's not enough nitrate in those vegetables. Number two is if we eradicate the bacteria in our mouth, then we kill these nitrate-reducing bacteria and we completely eliminate the nitric oxide benefits of a vegetarian diet or eating a plant-based diet. And there's in America, the statistics are very clear that 2 out of 3 Americans use mouthwash every day. I don't know what it is in the UK or other regions.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I'm sure it's probably similar. We tend to follow yourselves in the statistics.
Yeah. So we've published in others that if you use mouthwash, it kills the good bacteria along with the bad. Yeah. You get an increase in blood pressure because you lose the production of nitric oxide. You actually lose the cardioprotective benefits of exercise, and it sets you on this rapid progression of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, everything that's related to nitric oxide. So that's one. And then the third thing is you have to have stomach acid. Yeah. And there are these drugs, classes of drugs called antacids or proton pump inhibitors. Mm-hmm. There's 200 million prescriptions written for those every year in the U.S. And now you can purchase these products over the counter. You don't even need a prescription for this. So when you shut down stomach acid production, that's probably the worst thing you can do physiologically speaking, because now you can't make nitric oxide, you can't break proteins down into amino acids. You develop foodborne allergens, osteoporosis. You can't absorb things like calcium, selenium, zinc, iron. You become anemic, and most importantly. And this was a study published, I believe, in 2016. People who have been on these antacids for 3 to 5 years have a 40% higher incidence of heart attack and stroke.
Wow.
So these drugs are absolutely killing people because they're shutting down nitric oxide production and putting you at an increased risk for heart attack and stroke. So what I tell people is you got to change your diet, throw in some more green leafy vegetables. If you use mouthwash, you absolutely have to stop. And if you're on an antacid, you absolutely have to get off your antacids, because everything we're doing is shutting down nitric oxide production, and the consequences of that are very clear and deadly.
And I'd love to, because I have skeptics around me, as we all do, who have been, I loosely use the word brainwashed by industry into believing that mouthwash is going to enhance their overall oral health, but actually the opposite is true. How would you recommend people who are now listening to this podcast message out the shift that is needed, not only at the skeptics from your household, friends, family, and so on level, but also to your local dentist who may be advising that mouthwash is the next best thing, and that's going to really help your oral health, which absolutely is not true. And I don't use mouthwash anymore because of exactly the reason that you mentioned, and also it just like you said, it destroys the good bugs in your mouth that you really need.
Yeah. Well, I recommend people read the published literature. I mean, you can go to PubMed, which is basically a database of every single peer-reviewed journal or publication out there. And, you won't see mainstream media pick up on these types of studies because it's really disruptive to a lot of these big companies, these consumer product goods companies, these pharmaceutical companies that are selling billions of dollars every year in mouthwash and antiseptics. So this is completely disruptive to a lot of companies, and they don't want to hear this, and they certainly don't want their customers to hear this.
And it even includes fluoride as well, right, doesn't it? Because fluoride is disruptive to the oral microbiome as well. So you should not have toothpaste with fluoride in it because it's not healthy, nor should you have water with fluoride in it, which for some a reason beyond many of the functional medicine doctors' understanding here in the UK, they've decided to introduce in parts of the country into the drinking water, which is going to ensue a sort of a local health crisis in the future unless people filter the water, because they've deemed that it's actually healthy to your oral health, which is actually completely incorrect.
Yeah, no, look, fluoride is an element on the periodic table. It's one of the most toxic elements. It's a neurotoxin, it's antiseptic, and it destroys your thyroid function. I mean, we have a global pandemic on hypothyroidism.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to get rid of fluoride. I mean, if you look at the back of your toothpaste, a fluorinated toothpaste, you'll see on there, at least in the US, it says, if you swallow this, call poison control. So fluoride is a poison. It was used as rat poison years ago. So get rid of fluoride in your toothpaste. The reason they put it in water is to kill the bacteria in the water supply, because it's antiseptic. So it's antiseptic in your mouth. It's antiseptic when the dentist puts it on your teeth. It kills the good guys and it kills the bad guys. But the collateral damage it does is much worse than the benefit. So for me, everything is kind of risk benefit. The risk of fluoride far outweigh any benefits you're ever going to receive from it. So for me, it's an easy decision. You have to get the fluoride-free toothpaste, get a home filtration system, and remove the fluoride from your water supply, because it's not just the water you're drinking, it's the water you're bathing in, heating up to 105 degrees and volatilizing the fluoride and the chlorine and the chloramine and the chloride, and it's absorbed in the lungs, and it's extremely toxic.
And I just, this is not new science. It may be, for me, I've relatively recently learned about it, but it's not new in the context of the research out there. Is there, and I know there's other doctors, and maybe I'm asking a question that you can't answer, but I'm sort of curious to understand, if you know the answer, why are we still allowing fluoride in toothpaste? Why? I just don't get why there's such a drive. I'm assuming because industry are in the pockets of the organizations that have the power to change that.
Well, at least in the US, you have these really powerful organizations called the American Medical Association that establishes the standard of care and the licensing for physicians. And for dentists, you have the American Dental Association. And these organizations are funded by big pharma, big companies. So they dictate the policy and really the curriculum of this. So I go and I ask dentists all the time. I have a number of dental friends and colleagues, and I go, why are you still using fluoride? And they go, well, it's just the way we've always done it. I go, well, you know what? We used to use leeches to exsanguinate patients years ago too, but we don't do that anymore for good reasons. The progression of science and research and development allows us to realize what we did 50 years ago, 60 years ago probably wasn't a good idea. And
we used to use gas as lighting, and that's not safe.
That's right. No. And so I think we're going to look forward 20, 30 years from now and look back and go, holy smokes, we were using fluoride, a known neurotoxin, in the water supply, and look what happened. We have the sickest population around the world. I mean, we have the most innovative science and technology to really understand the mechanism of every single human disease, diagnose it, prevent it, treat it, cure it, but yet we have the sickest population in the world at any time in the history of the world. So what we're doing is not working. And when we look back, there's a lot of people going to go, wow. And I never questioned it because I just trust it. And we cannot trust anymore because there's too much power in the big companies that are making billions of dollars, that what we do in terms of innovations and science and discovery is disruptive to them. And there's enormous resistance to getting the proper science, the proper information, and the right information into the hands of the masses.
And I think, that ties back nicely into the theme of this podcast, which is brain health. And we're kind of using our brains against ourselves in the context of evolution. We're in a devolution state. Actually, we're seeing people, their life expectancy is decreasing when it should be increasing because of the way in which we've, and I'll go back to the word brainwashed, the nation in the context of what is good for them and what isn't. And in fact, there's a lot of lies out there. If I go back to brain health, I'd love to know, in the context of your life's journey, what does optimal brain health mean for you personally?
Well, the brain is a really a magnificent organ. And, when we lose its function, we lose really the whole essence of life. And it's, being able to build relationships and express love and serve others. So for me, it's all about, being able to communicate, to build relationships, to show love, and to be able to direct our own thoughts. Because, we live in a very stressful world. I have a very stressful life. And if our brain is not able to comprehend, to take in these external stimuli and then process it, and if your brain's not functioning properly, then the stress and these stressors can actually destroy you. So for me, in really the stressful world that I live in, and the enormous pressure, and people coming after you, and trying to continue to innovate and move the science forward, is for me optimal brain health is being able to not only function but to process information and be able to take the assaults we get on a daily basis, and then process that, and then not let it bother us. Right. So we have to be able to process it, integrate it. And then for me, I try to make a very deliberate effort not to worry about things I can't control. And that requires enormous brain activity, because we're worriers, right? I think human nature is, when things happen to us, good or bad, typically bad things, then we worry about it. But I make a deliberate effort to, specifically a conscious effort, I do not worry about things I cannot control. Now, the things that I control, then I can worry about. I can make deliberate decisions. And as long as my brain is functioning properly, then I can process that information and hopefully make good choices.
Yeah. Do I love that, because you touched on, the 5 pillars of brain health. We talk about feelings, our actions, and our connections to ourselves and others, which is a fundamental part of communication and building relationships. Our thoughts, which you mentioned, is directing your own thoughts and the importance of that. And then also the surroundings and the toxins and how that really influences us. I'd love to dive into the communication piece that you mentioned and go back into the role of nitric oxide in our brain health, if you wouldn't mind, is to dive a little bit deeper into the importance of nitric oxide in our brain. What symptoms we may be experiencing when we are deficient, and what the knock-on effects of that are for us personally, from a cognitive perspective, and then if we dive a bit deeper into the rest of our bodily systems.
Well, nitric oxide is really important in the brain, probably one of the most affected organs by nitric oxide, because there's 2 main roles of nitric oxide in the brain. Number one, it controls the regulation of blood flow. So when we need to recall memory, for example, then we have to increase blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. And without sufficient nitric oxide production, you can't dilate the blood vessels and increase perfusion to certain regions of the brain. So when that happens, we don't recall memory, we develop cognitive disorders, and then eventually it'll develop into Alzheimer's if you don't fix the metabolic perturbations in the nitric oxide or in the brain and restore blood flow. But secondly, nitric oxide is a neurotransmitter. So it's what we call a retrograde messenger. So in the brain, you have these synapses. You've got the post-synaptic cleft and the presynaptic. So when nitric oxide is produced, it's a gas, and then it travels back into the presynaptic cleft, and it controls things like glutamate and CGRP and a lot of these neurotransmitters. So if you can't make nitric oxide, then you get a dysregulation of synaptic transmission or neurotransmission. So loss of nitric oxide can be responsible for vascular dementia, where you have focal ischemia, loss of regulation of blood flow to certain regions of the brain. It can be responsible for psychotic disorders, where there's a dysregulation of amino acid neurotransmitters or any synaptic transmission. So we have to restore the function of the enzyme, and we have to be able to really recapitulate nitric oxide signaling, which we know how to do now by restoring the function of the enzyme. And we can do it through proper diet and just feeding this enterosalivary circuit of nitric oxide.
And that starts in the gut, of course, or starts in the mouth that we mentioned, but the importance of activating that enzyme in the gut in order to allow the release of nitric oxide that then obviously travels as a neurotransmitter to the brain. Is that correct?
No, that's right. So and let me just make clear, there's other reasons for developing neurocognitive disorders or loss of electrical activity in the brain. Nitric oxide's kind of not the silver bullet to fix all that. You may have a deficiency of amino acids because you're taking antacids and you can't break down proteins into amino acids. So you develop a deficiency in some of these amino acid neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, things like that are built upon basic amino acids. But in order for this to work, in order for the communication aspects of nitric oxide, which is a signaling molecule, then you can have all this together, but if you can't make nitric oxide, then the cells can't communicate with one another and they become dysfunctional, and you develop neurocognitive disorders. And
in the context of your research that you've done and the innovations that have come out of it, what are the key steps that the interventions to up lift the nitric oxide in our body in order to address some of these cognitive challenges that people experience that perhaps they can't do themselves? Because I know you've got some really neat innovations out there.
Yeah. Well, to be able to do this, we had to go back and understand the mechanism of what goes wrong in people that can't make nitric oxide. So about 10 or 15 years ago, we figured this out. So we know how the human body makes nitric oxide. We know what goes wrong in people that can't make it. And now we know how to fix it, right? So our whole concept was in developing safe and effective nitric oxide product technology is if the human body can't make it, then we got to do it for you, right? It's like, hormone replacement therapy in either men or women. If men can't make testosterone for whatever reason, then we give it to them. If women aren't making estrogen because they're menopausal, then we have to give it to them. So very similar concept with nitric oxide, but completely different than hormone replacement therapy. When we give nitric oxide, we don't shut down endogenous production of it. At least our technology does. Because the other thing we do is if we fix the reason people can't make nitric oxide. So what is that? Well, we recouple the nitric oxide synthase enzyme in the endothelium and the epithelium, but we also restore the production of the right bacteria in the oral cavity. And so we do this. And so as I mentioned earlier, nitric oxide is a gas. So how do you deliver a gas it's gone in less than a second to a human being? And really the only way to do this, and I was the first person and still the only person to deliver a solid dose form of a bioactive gas. So we do this in a couple of ways. We make an orally disintegrating tablet that when you put this tablet in your mouth, it dissolves over usually 5 to 6 minutes. But as it's slowly dissolving, it's releasing nitric oxide gas. It's vasoactive. It's biologically active. We can see dilation of the blood vessels typically within 12 seconds. So we know we're releasing nitric oxide, we can quantify it, we can detect it, we can verify it. It's vasoactive, we can see a normalization of blood pressure, but we also recouple the enzyme in the lining of the blood vessels. So now we're improving the body's ability to make nitric oxide on its own. So our whole concept is if you're low in nitric oxide, if you have endothelial dysfunction, then you can take this lozenge, it releases nitric oxide, and it's going to improve your endothelial function. And then hopefully over time, you need less and less of this product. But because we live in a very toxic world, whether it's EMFs or herbicides or pesticides or environmental toxicants, we almost always need a kind of a supplemental dose of nitric oxide. So we can do this through a lozenge. We can do it through a beet powder that you put in water, and it immediately generates nitric oxide gas. We've done this topically through a dual chamber delivery that you apply to the skin, releases nitric oxide, and you can actually see it dilating the blood vessels on the skin. It'll turn pink. And so we're improving blood flow to that particular area in which it's applied.
And obviously, because it's nitric oxide, your body knows exactly what to do with it. So it just goes straight into the cells.
No, that's right. Yeah, no, it's a very important concept you bring up, because when we develop drugs, there's a whole field called pharmacology, right? We create these synthetic compounds that are designed to inhibit a particular biochemical reaction. What we do in terms of nitric oxide is what we call restorative physiology. So this is not pharmacology, what we're doing. This is restorative physiology. So the question is, how much nitric oxide does a person need over how long a period of time? So about 25 years ago, we understood how much nitric oxide a healthy 18, 20-year-old person would make over a 24-hour period. So what we do in terms of innovations and drug development is let's give back what's missing, right? And never give the body something that it's not used to seeing, because we know too little nitric oxide is bad, too much nitric oxide can be bad. So we had to dial in the right amount of nitric oxide that would completely recapitulate nitric oxide-based signaling if all systems were intact.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, and I'd love to know what the findings are when you, if we focus on the start state where it's discovered nitric oxide, when we elevate people's own ability to generate nitric oxide through the use of lozenges or from the beet juice that you mentioned, what improvements have you noted in the research that you've done on their vascular health?
Well, there's a number of published clinical trials in humans. So this is an animal data we're talking about. We're talking about actual human beings that we've translated this into. So when we restore nitric oxide through any of these technologies, we see an improvement in blood pressure, right? So 2 out of 3, at least Americans, I think it's probably global, people have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure, which is the number one risk factor for cardiovascular disease, the number one killer of men and women worldwide. So we can normalize blood pressure. We see an improvement in exercise performance. So whether you're a well-trained athlete or just somebody who's trying to perform at the best level, nitric oxide can improve exercise performance. It improves mitochondrial function, so the cells are generating more energy more efficiently with less oxygen. We see an improvement in sexual function. There's a whole epidemic of erectile dysfunction in both men and women. When we restore the production of nitric oxide, you can dilate the blood vessels of the sex organs and get engorgement and get better sexual function. We're seeing an improvement in brain health, improvement in cognition. We're seeing a regression of cardiovascular disease. We've had people that had, plaque deposit in the lining of their blood vessels. In 6 months, we're seeing about 11% plaque regression. What else? Better kidney function. We're reversing heart disease. I mean, these are all published data in humans that we've been able to document and verify the importance of nitric oxide in really most, if not all, chronic diseases.
And I'd love to know on the sort of generic hot topic question, I suppose, as it were, is long COVID, which is, I think, perceived as a vascular issue by many. And how your vascular system gets disrupted through the attack of the COVID virus. With the addition of nitric oxide, have you noticed that people's long COVID symptoms have reduced, or is that something you've not yet studied?
No, absolutely. We've studied that. In fact, in 2020, we had a drug, our nitric oxide drug, in phase 3 clinical trials for COVID. So we understood early on the etiology of those that got sick and died from COVID. So here's what happens with COVID. The coronavirus attaches to the ACE receptor on the epithelial cells, primarily in the airway. And then that ACE receptor internalizes it. And then the spike protein is what's transported. And the spike protein is the toxin. So there's ACE receptors on our endothelial cells. So it activates, it's taken up by the endothelial cells. The endothelial cells create what's called an expression of adhesion molecules. And then platelets, monocytes, neutrophils start sticking to the lining of the blood vessels. You get platelet activation, elevation in D dimers, microclots, heart attacks, strokes. So everything we know about COVID relates to vascular inflammation, the spike protein activating this whole inflammatory cascade.
And it also attacks your mitochondria, so it causes mitochondrial dysfunction as well, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah, it's completely wreaks havoc on the cell. In inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. It starts this whole cascade of the onset and progression of chronic disease. But we published, I believe it was in 2007, that nitric oxide completely inhibits the upregulation of the adhesion molecules, prevents platelets, monocytes, and neutrophils from sticking to the lining of the blood vessels, and really downregulates the ACE receptor, so there's less target for the spike protein to bind to. So people with long COVID absolutely have to have the nitric oxide. And it's not just, in this really, really horrific experiment where they gave people the coronavirus mRNA, the spike protein mRNA. Now the body's producing spike protein. Now we have to deal with, or some people have to deal with the spike protein for the rest of their life. So how do we mitigate the inflammatory effects of the spike protein, whether it's from long COVID or whether it's from those that receive the mRNA vaccine? Nitric oxide is what controls and regulates and basically mitigates the inflammation caused by the spike protein.
Yeah, and I think it's such an important point that you mentioned with the mRNA, because there's been a lot of debate about the taking of the vaccine, and actually many functional medicine doctors here in the UK are very opposed to the use of the mRNA vaccine because of the consequences that have happened to people who have taken it. Who have developed severe reactions and in sometimes, in severe cases that unfortunately have passed away.
Yeah, well, you have to go back to the risk-benefit spectrum.
Yeah.
So early on, the data were very clear that the mRNA vaccine didn't prevent transmission. It did not prevent the progression of disease. And it was not improving rates of hospitalization, ventilation, or death. So there really was no benefit from it. What are the risks? Well, the risks were too many to even mention. Death, microclots, heart attack, and stroke. So when you have nothing but risk and no benefit, for me, that quotient is a very simple solution. There was no way I was ever going to get that shot because it was not going to provide me benefit. And it was going to subject me to enormous risk. And I think that's what we're learning now 3 years later when all the data are coming out. Now they're admitting it didn't prevent transmission. It didn't prevent the severity of disease. It didn't prevent death. And what did it do? it made people sick. And in some cases, it killed people.
And I think the fact that, you know, obviously from your research is there is a way to restore your nitric oxide production and to enhance your body's ability to produce nitric oxide by addressing the function of the endothelial enzyme that you mentioned earlier. What is next in the context of supporting people who have vascular issues, and you mentioned vascular dementia, and the use of nitric oxide to enhance their performance, whether that's enhancing them to maintain a normal level of health, or whether to achieve an optimal level of health?
Sure. Well, you know, we've had kind of over-the-counter products on the market now for, I don't know, many years, but we're taking this now through clinical trials to get approval for specific indications. Mm-hmm. So our COVID drug study, you know, COVID changed over the course of several years. And, you know, just to kind of go back to COVID, and we talked about the importance of nitric oxide. I think I was probably the best N=1 experiment. You know, since June of 2020, I've been on an airplane every week, all throughout COVID. At one point, we had 26 clinics here in the US where we were enrolling COVID patients, really sick, high-risk patients. And so I was in these COVID clinics every week, every month, on airplanes. I didn't wear a mask. I never got the vaccine, but yet I never developed COVID. So what happened? It's not that I wasn't exposed to COVID. It's that if we restore our nitric oxide, our ability to make nitric oxide, when we're exposed to the COVID, our immune cells goes to the site of attachment infection and shuts down viral replication, and we never get sick from it. So that's the best defense, is keeping a robust immune system and keeping the patient healthy so that they can mobilize an immune response and kill the virus before it has a chance to take hold and replicate and propagate throughout the body. Yeah. So we're developing drugs now, not only for, I mean, COVID's pretty much gone away. We'll resurrect our antiviral drug during the next pandemic. But we're developing, you know, our nitric oxide drug for things like Alzheimer's, and really affecting not just the loss of regulation of blood flow, because we can restore cerebral blood flow and we can measure this by SPECT or functional MRI, but we're basically reversing the metabolic dysfunction in diabetes, or in Alzheimer's. You know, Alzheimer's has been called diabetes type 3. So it's insulin resistance and an improper energy metabolism and glucose uptake. So nitric oxide is what potentiates insulin signaling, improves glucose uptake, so you can completely reverse the metabolic phenotype in Alzheimer's simply by nitric oxide. So when you restore blood flow, you reduce inflammation, you upregulate these signaling pathways that prevent protein misfolding. You don't get beta amyloid plaque, you don't get the tau tangles, and you restore the energy metabolism and the energetics in the brain, then it creates an environment where Alzheimer's will go away. We're basically correcting the underlying cellular energetics and metabolism in the brain, all through the production of nitric oxide.
I find that absolutely fascinating, that how, if you address the underlying cellular molecular communication system, that you can drastically change the outcome for people.
Well, it's not humorous. It's actually quite frightening. But, you know, all Alzheimer's drugs that have been tried to be developed for the past 20 or 30 years have failed.
Yeah,
right?
Every
single one of them. And why is that? It's because these companies and these scientists were going after and targeting the beta amyloid or the tau tangles. Mm-hmm. That's not the cause of disease. It's a consequence of disease.
That's the consequence of it.
Yeah, there's no way these drugs targeted at the tau tangles or the beta amyloid are ever going to do anything to disease. You've missed the boat.
Yeah.
Those are consequences of disease. What we're doing through our drug program is getting to the root cause of disease. We understand without a doubt what causes Alzheimer's, and we know mechanistically how to reverse and change the energetics, change the perfusion of the brain, and can overcome the metabolic phenotypes of Alzheimer's and prevent the consequences of disease, which are the beta amyloid, the tau tangle, and misfolded proteins.
Yeah. And it's kind of like saying, oh, I'm sorry you've got a broken leg, but we're not going to image it. We're just going to give you a plaster and some pain relief. And you're going to have to take that for the rest of your life, which will be shorter. But we're not going to address the underlying fact that you've broken your leg and now you've got no ability to function. And I think, you know, this is, for me, is where medicine needs to go in the next 30 years, is the focus on communication, which you mentioned what optimal brain health is for you, it is the communication molecules that are so fundamental to every single process in our body, to every single system in our body, with nitric oxide being, one of the first Nobel Prize awarded in the importance of redox signaling molecules.
Sure.
And there's been many more since then, I think 6 since then, around the topic of redox biochemistry. Understand that there's a dance between the nutrients that we need in our body in order for our body to function, and how we communicate the sending of those nutrients to the vital organs that need it. And the last sort of 30 years and beyond has been focusing on nutrients, and there's no real focus on the communication that's necessary to get those nutrients to where they need to go, which is nitric oxide is such an important
you make a very good point. So in most dysfunctional tissue, whether it's the prefrontal cortex of the brain, there's by definition decreased blood flow. We call it ischemia or hypoxia. So there's not enough blood flow. So you can be replete in nutrients and take all the nutrients you want, but if you're not delivering to that particular part of the brain or that particular tissue or cell, then that tissue is depleted. The body's not depleted. So you got to open up the blood vessels and now deliver those nutrients to the individual tissues and cells that need them. And then the body can regenerate and the cells can perform their function.
Yeah, it's like ordering lots of things on Amazon but having no delivery mechanism.
That's right. The traffic, right?
And not paying any attention to the route that it needs to take.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, great analogy.
So I'd love to know, for in the context of nitric oxide itself, what is it that what aspect of intake do you think will really transform people's health at a layperson level? So we talked about the chronic or extreme diseases that people experience, including Alzheimer's. Absolutely so important that we address that, but we also have to elevate our own baseline health level. What aspect do you think will really make that transformation, given the things that we discussed at the beginning, where we are being depleted of nitric oxide? Is there anything that you think really will make us a tectonic shift in that space?
No, I do. And look, I think we understand, unequivocally how the body makes nitric oxide, and now we can fix that. So, I try to teach people, inform people of, you only got to do 2 things to restore your nitric oxide. Mm-hmm. Stop doing the things that disrupt it and start doing the things that promote it. So what is that? If you're using mouthwash, you got to stop. If you're using fluoride, you got to get rid of it. Stop using antacids. And then, so those are the 3 things you stop doing.
Yeah.
And that's really easy, right? We're not changing habits. We're just basically eliminating some things that are getting in the way of your body making nitric oxide.
And it will save you money.
It'll save you money, is right. And then just start doing the things that promote it. Green leafy vegetables, moderate physical exercise, 20 to 30 minutes of sunlight a day. Certain wavelengths of light will stimulate nitric oxide release. And it's really that simple. And then when all else fails, we develop products that do it for you. But that's not our first approach. Our first approach is to give the body what it needs so the body can do its job. Yeah. But, just like you may be deficient in certain nutrients, if you're deficient in nitric oxide, then we can provide that for you through different product technologies. But really, the body's designed to do its own job. So if we just got to get out of the way, right? Let the body do its job.
Yeah. I love that you brought it back home to everybody. Is the importance that we've got the power to empower ourselves, but we just need to be sensible, and like you say, do the things that help us and avoid the things that hurt us.
It's really that simple.
So key, and it's such a simple thing to do. Don't stop using mouthwash. Remove fluoride from your water and from your toothpaste. Make sure that you have enough sun exposure. Make sure that you eat your green leafy vegetables. Make sure that you exercise,
Yeah, we got to
and
move.
don't take antacids or anything that's going to disrupt your pH in your stomach.
That's simple, right? So
Yeah.
we spent 45 minutes talking about the complexity of human disease, and it boils down to something so simple.
And do you know what I love about it? You know, for such a fundamentally important molecule, we can teach our kids this. You
For
know,
sure.
this is something that we can educate at kindergarten level, nursery level. Every child, as soon as they're able to talk, it is able to learn the importance of nitric oxide and how they can take key steps to change their health and ultimately their wealth at the end of it.
Yeah, and I think, Dr. Ruth, that's why what you do is so vitally important, because I've taught in medical schools, I've taught future physicians, I've published over 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles, but that only gets you so far, because the lay people typically don't read the scientific literature. So we have to be able to communicate this information to the masses, and I think that's kind of the platform that you have. So now anybody, there's no more excuses. Ignorance is curable, right? And we're solving a lot of ignorance here by just providing the right information, overcoming the misinformation that's been out there.
Yeah.
And so anybody, anywhere can listen to this, teach their kids this, and it's amazing results. I get hundreds of emails, texts, and phone calls every week of lives that have been changed simply by listening to these, what I think are common sense concepts, and just eliminating some things, focusing on nitric oxide, and it changes their life. It's really amazing. And there's nothing more gratifying than that, I can tell you.
Yeah. And for all those that listening, you've heard it from the expert. Dr. Nathan Bryan is, a renowned expert in the field of nitric oxide, and he's not one to pull the wool over your eyes by any stretch of the imagination. So please do take his comments on board, and the simplicity of really enhancing our nitric oxide uptake. And if you don't have the capacity to do that because of your health conditions, then reach out to Dr. Nathan and his webpage. And I know you're going to talk about that in a minute, about how you can learn more about the amazing products he's now got on the market to really help upregulate your nitric oxide production. Dr. Nathan, it's been an absolute fascinating conversation. What one piece of advice, or maybe a couple, I know we mentioned a lot just now, would you give to anybody who is concerned about their overall health and wondering, could this be a nitric oxide deficiency?
Well, I think what we're finding is that people who have been poorly managed or had their chronic disease poorly managed by allopathic medicine for a number of years, you have to start looking. You can't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. So that's why we try to empower the patient. Go ask your physician about nitric oxide. Make them learn and understand it. Because what we're finding is many of these chronically or poorly managed chronic diseases can simply be restored and reversed by enhancing one's nitric oxide. You can eliminate the things we talked about, start doing the things that we discussed, and remarkably, you start to see patients get better. And that's really life-changing for people who have, suffered for many years and decades and unresolved symptoms or diseases when their physicians overlooked it. And when patients get better, that's the ultimate goal. But we have to empower the patient today. The physician, you can't rely on the physician. I think they're good-willed, they're well-intended, but the system in which they operate doesn't allow them to ask the right questions and really provide the right resources to their patients, because there's not enough time in the patient-physician interaction.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and insights into the importance of nitric oxide. How can people get hold of you, learn more about what you do, your products, and the services that you offer?
Yeah, so I'm not here to sell you products. I'm here to really provide education and information. So first place I send people is to my educational website, drnathans.bryan.com. I do a monthly blog there. There's a 6-minute video that'll kind of tell you kind of the basics of nitric oxide. I have my own YouTube channel. It's Dr. Nathan S. Bryan, Nitric Oxide. Done a number of lectures, podcasts, interviews on there. I'm certainly searchable on any search engine. And then for those of you interested in the product technology, they're trying it or trying to figure out if nitric oxide may be a solution for you, that's www.n101.com. And to your audience, Dr. Ruth, we're offering a 10% discount and free shipping if they put in the coupon code Dr. Ruth. So that'll give you a chance to try the products, and I'm certain that it will have a positive impact in your life, because we make nitric oxide, and if your body can't make it, we do it for you, and the results and the consequences of that are life-changing many times.
Oh, thank you. And make sure you do go to Dr. Nathan's website, which is, the information will be posted below the show notes, and it will be n101.com for the discount to enter the coupon code there. Is that correct?
That's correct. Just use Dr. Ruth in the coupon code, and we'll give you 10% off and free shipping.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nathan. It's been an absolutely really insightful conversation, and I'm just so excited about what the future brings for those people that are struggling with their health and the underlying root causes associated with the redox signaling molecule nitric oxide, which is so fundamental to every system in our body. Remember, this show is all about brain health, unchaining your pain. You are not stuck with the brain you have the power to make it better. And Dr. Nathan Bryan has kindly been here to show us now. Thank you, Dr. Nathan Bryan.
Thank you, Dr. Ruth.
You're most welcome.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to like and share this episode and leave a review on my website or on Apple Podcasts. If you're looking for opportunities to optimize your brain health or unchain your pain from a past trauma, make sure you visit my website www.ruthmaryallen.com and use the code podcast10 at checkout to get 10% off all programs. And always remember, you are not stuck with the brain you have. You have the power to make it better. You have the power to unchain your pain and optimize your brain power and performance so that you can win back energy and time doing what you love.